the idea that 1 and 3 were achieving criticality as well. So that's really worrying. Right now, they're saying it's not a sign of criticality, but there are some other worrying indications that are coming out right now, including this one: reactor 2 hydrogen levels rising despite work to improve reliability of nitrogen injection. And then there's another really important story about Xenon not Xenon 135. That was the one that originally prompted them to start investigating this. But there was a 100-fold increase in Krypton 95, if I'm reading that correctly. 100-fold increase on November 2nd, which is a different byproduct, and Krypton 85, and it points to, again, this hasn't been explained from what I understand from their latest retraction of the criticality call. They're talking about Xenon 135. Oh, that was the spontaneous fission of this curium, but they haven't talked yet about the Krypton 85, which you can go and you can look at TEPCO's reports, because they're releasing all these details, very detailed analyses of what they're finding, and you can see that on their reports, but they're not talking about the Krypton 85. And then there's another video that came out the other day. Informable picked up on this. Just incredible. It looks like there's a new hole in the containment for Unit 2. It hasn't been verified yet, and I don't see anyone else reporting on it, but if you go and look at the video, there's definitely something there that wasn't there the other day. So the implication is that there might have been another explosion. There might have been something, I don't know, forcing its way out of there. We don't know at this point, but Informable also managed to capture some video of the crane doing some testing right outside where that hole is. So that raises the possibility that maybe that's where they're doing the testing, that they found the Xenon 135, and who knows if this is related to something much, much bigger going on right there that we don't know about. And that's the point, because what we've seen with this whole disaster is they keep not telling us about critical things until months later. Oh yeah, by the way, we detected meltdown in the first few hours of the disaster. I mean, just ridiculous things like that.
Well, that was my next point, is that if you go back to when all this started, we saw mushroom clouds, huge explosions, reactor cores injected into the sky, and months later they said, yeah, the Japanese government covered it up with bulldozers and didn't even mark where they covered the rods. A mile and a half away. It's so important, and you were on air covering that, and I remember your coverage of that in the first few days, and you were looking at the explosion, and you were noting, well, that looks like there are rods going out, and all of that sort of stuff, and that did come out later, and they just kind of blithely buried it in some New York Times stories.
All
I did was go up and look at the General Electric designs, and then say that, but it did turn out that was true. But it turns out they knew it the whole time and lied to people. But in Japan, a lot of the government's gotten in trouble. Here, as the smog drifts over, and the trade winds and the jet stream over to North America, it's just, hey, it's fine, go to sleep.
Yeah, well, I think there are two interesting things to take out of the whole Fukushima debacle, and one of them is the fact that I'm sure your listeners don't need to be told this, but here it is again, triple confirmed, that anytime there's a threat to the system itself, to the functioning of the big corporations that are in bed with the big government or the overarching system, whenever there's a threat to that, they will rally around themselves to protect themselves, and they don't care at all about the average person. And that came out when the Prime Minister, who was the Prime Minister during this crisis, Naoto Kan, when he left office, he did some interviews, and he said, oh, by the way, guess what? When I was Prime Minister in the wake of this crisis, and I was asking my advisors, what is the worst thing that can happen? Like, in worst case scenario, what should we do? What'll happen? And they were saying, you're going to have to evacuate Tokyo. And he said he ruled it out immediately because that would call into question the viability of Japan as a nation.
Well, let me raise that.
The point.
Let me raise that point, because I forgot the percentage of folks that live in Tokyo for overall Japan.
I think it's 30 million in the greater metropolitan area out of, 125 million, something like that.
So you're talking about 25%.
It's in that range, yeah. Yeah,
so, but I've seen documentaries now, and people pointing out that an American tourist, that just 2 years ago or a year ago, you'd go and the subways were jammed, the streets were jammed. Now I've seen videos where it's like a ghost town in many cases. Are you seeing that living in Japan, that the Japanese have evacuated to the south or the west?
I'm seeing the exact opposite in a lot of ways. I would expect it to be a lot different, but it seems that it's not that way. And I personally, I've still never even been to that part of the country. I've never even been in that area, so I don't know from firsthand. But I've seen, for example, on Zero Hedge yesterday, they had some coverage of a guy who went to Fukushima and basically taking pictures of the town, just everyone, going about their business, and everything just seemed like normal. And I think that's been the way that the Japanese have been coping with this to a certain extent, on a certain surface level. The old Japanese mentality of just gut up and take it, and that's one of the reactions. But I think there's an underlying reaction that's going on here that suggests something completely different. Because NHK is also reporting today 70% in Japan want end to nuclear power, and that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. Because of course, the Japanese have an aversion to nuclear power and have had for a long time. Obviously, given the history of Hiroshima and all of that. But I think what this indicates is that finally people are starting to speak up about it, and you're starting to see movements of people and organizations and protests of nuclear power that are growing, and I think becoming a bigger force in Japan. And that's something that I'm not sure would have happened if it wasn't for something like Fukushima. So I think there is some sort of countervailing tendency. The public is waking up. The public are questioning what they're being told, and that's a very hopeful sign for a society like Japan. But is it enough?
Well, it certainly is a hopeful thing, because they're trying to build more of these nuclear power plants. And I'm not against technology, but you had in the 50s
exactly
a plant
right.
blow
Well,
up.
The thing is, they can construct nuclear power plants in a safer way. But the reason that we use the uranium, the reason it's been constructed like this, is because of the nuclear weapons industry, and it's really a byproduct of that. Is the reason we have the construction that we have today, which is inherently unsafe and is going to cause more disasters like this in the future.
Well, you're right about that, and so they won't let us have all these clean technologies or cleaner. We've got all this 40-year-old designs. You had Simi Valley reactor blow up in the 50s. They covered that up. We've had all these other reactor disasters, and there's just this establishment belief that if they're just delusional and say it's all fine, that makes it okay.
It's not only that. I mean, if you look in the way that the reaction to this played out, even in Japan, let alone in America and in Canada and all around the world, but in Japan, of course, in the immediate wake of the disaster, they raised the maximum radiation levels for the nuclear power plant workers to 250 millisieverts from 100, and they've just put it back down to 100. So it just goes to show that these figures that they give the public are just as meaningless as they make it. I mean, it's not worth the paper it's not written on, basically, that they can just adjust these numbers anytime they like, and it is truly just to preserve the functioning of the state and preserve the functioning of the company and make sure that they can't get sued in the future. It has nothing to do with public safety. The exact same thing with the maximum allowable radiation limits in food, which they bumped up in the wake of the disaster to 500 millisieverts or 500 becquerels per kilogram, which they've just once again brought down to put it in line with international standards. But again, it shows you they just put it up and down, whatever they need in order to cover their hind ends and make sure that they're safe and sound, and that nothing will be able to challenge their monopolies of power.
Well, we're talking to James Corbett of the Corbett Report. James, getting into other issues, you've covered Libya, you've covered what's happening right now in the Euro, you've covered Israel openly saying they're getting ready to strike Iran 3 weeks after we first started reporting on it. Geopolitically, what do you see as the biggest threat on the horizon?
I'm really concerned about the way the Syria and Iran talk is ramping up again after they seem to be distracted with the whole Libyan campaign. But of course, after they got rid of Gaddafi, it's just what's the next one on the list? And it looks like it's going to be Syria if things unfold as they're unfolding. And we see that we see so many parallels between the campaign to demonize Syria right now and the campaign that was used to demonize Libya, and even the campaign that was used against Hussein back in '91. So, for example, back in January of this year, the Human Rights Council was holding meetings and considering whether to give Libya a human rights award for all of their great work in educating their population and having relative freedom in their society. Literally in January, they were talking about that. And then in February, this bunch of NGOs came together to write this letter protesting what. And 3 days after they wrote that letter to the UN, the Human Rights Council convened a special session in which they condemned Libya. They condemned Gaddafi. They wanted him out of the Human Rights Council. They wanted Security Council to take over. And of course, that started the whole ball rolling that led to the no-fly zone, which turned into a bombing campaign overnight. However, that happened.
Peace action. I mean, a Peace Prize winner led it, though, so it's liberal. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the liberal love the little girl with her jaw blown off with her tongue hanging out, screaming in pain. I mean, that's trendy, James.
And if you try to put that up on YouTube or something, then you must be a terrorist, and we have to take that down right away. No, unfortunately, that's the way this plays out. But as I'm saying, the exact same thing is happening in Syria right now, and we have to be aware of this because you have these London-based Syrian human rights watchdogs who are now saying that, for example, the ceasefire that was supposedly reached in recent days, Damascus and the protesters who are really an armed insurgency, was broken by Assad's forces who were firing on people. But this, of course, is, again, another unattributed report. We don't have any confirmation of this. It's all coming from this London-based watchdog, which back in August actually had an incubator baby story about Syria. There was this report that went around. Even CNN picked up on it and was reporting on it. That they cut off the power in Hama, and thus these incubator babies are going to die.
It's for the children.
The worst part is they had the picture of these babies, and it turned out the picture was actually taken in Egypt. It had nothing to do with Syria whatsoever, but just anything to try to hammer home to the people that this is the bad man. We have to go after him.
Well, that's my point. Is I mean, a lot of these countries are run by corrupt governments, but the people running our system are like scientific manipulating criminals who are putting cancer viruses in the vaccine and saying, don't worry about radiation, we'll just raise the level and say it's safe. I mean, when it comes to this panopticon of criminals, the biggest ones are running our societies.
That's exactly right. And that's the point, isn't it? Because it's not like I'm for Assad or for his government or I'm defending Syria in that regard. It's just that I don't want to watch another thing happen like what happened in Libya, where these allegations somehow become facts that we have to act on.
Well, what about these protesters in Syria, openly Western funded, saying, please bomb us, level everything? I mean, this is crazy.
It's ridiculous, and unfortunately, unless we can get the word out about what's really what might be really happening, or just put the call out to start questioning some of these reports, unless we can get that message out there in a big way, it's going to unfold exactly like it did in Libya, because this is part of a template, it's part of a strategy. Demonize anyone who strikes out at these armed protesters or whatever's happening, this destabilization, that, as you say, it's now been proven from the leaked documents that the U.S. State Department has been funding the Syrian opposition for years.
They fund a bunch of rebels to blow stuff up. The government fights it, whether that's wrong or right. Then they call them innocent protesters, and then NATO blows the hell out of the country. And I mean, and they call it peace. I mean, it's incredible.
And then they raid the $200 billion coffers that Gaddafi had, and no one's questioning where that money's going, are they?
Amazing. What's your view, James Corbett, of what's happening in Europe, Greece, this open announcement by the Vatican for world government?
Well, that's unfortunately not too surprising to anyone who's been watching the Vatican in recent years and the calls for a new world order and everything that we've seen coming out of there. But certainly, I think the whole European situation just speaks once again to the fact that governments are just there to preserve themselves and don't care at all about the populations they're allegedly ruling over. And we see that with the Greek thing. This week it came out, it was a big deal. Oh my God, it's explosive information. Greece is actually going to give their population a chance to vote on this European bailout proposal that's going to put them and their children into servitude. They're actually going to get a vote on it. Imagine that. What a revolutionary idea. And the latest that I've heard, it's coming out today that, no, actually, they're not going to give them a vote. They managed to strike a deal to transfer power over to the next group of thugs that are going to move the political football further down the field. So they don't have to give the people a vote at all. So that's good. That crisis is averted. Because the crisis is not the idea that people are going to